Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody here. Yes, I'm going to look back a bit at the application of the EU ETS in Ireland, and some of my team, my very dedicated co-workers, are here today as well, and I'd like to pay tribute to them and to all those who've helped to set the system up in Ireland, and also to the colleagues in the EU, one of which you've heard from today, but they're also a very important part of our work, the interaction with them. So my presentation is going to focus a lot on the ETS1, so-called ETS1, which was where it all began with the stationary installations. But as that opening slide hints at there, we are also responsible for ETS aviation and maritime since the beginning of this year, and for the new ETS2, which looks at buildings, road transport and additional sectors, and for the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So the ETS1 stationary area, that's 112 stationary installations as of this year, and the number hasn't changed that much since when we started, though there are different companies involved now. And the biggest emitters and also the smallest emitters are the power gen sector and the data centres, who have a lot of capacity on standby. So in a typical year, they wouldn't use their electricity generation very much because they're taking electricity from the grid. We have a small number of industries that are particular activities under the ETS: cement and lime, gypsum manufacture, oil refining, alumina refining. And then the vast majority of those installations we're dealing with are in what's called the other combustion sector. And they're the large energy companies, biopharmaceutical companies, large energy users like dairy processing and other food and drink sector companies. So the point of this slide really is that all of those industries, while they're significant for us, they are only about 22% of our national greenhouse gas emissions, because we have a very small industrial base compared to, say, Germany, who you'll hear from later on. So how have the emissions evolved over the years? Well, we started out in 2005. We had a national allocation plan where everyone was getting some free allocation, and our emissions were 22.4 million tonnes in 2005. This year, the 2024 emissions amounted to 11.3 million tonnes. So that's a decrease of 50%. So to me, that's already a strong argument for the ETS. Last year, the emissions decreased by 7.3% from the electricity generation sector. And overall, since 2005, the power gen emissions have decreased by more than 58%. So it's really a reduction in the electricity sector that has been driving down the emissions overall. And that's exactly the same pattern that's repeated across the EU. If you've read the Commission's press release this year in April on the emissions results for 2024, 50% reduction since 2005, and a large decrease because of the electricity sector. So the price in carbon coming from the ETS supports our move towards renewables, and it will continue to incentivise the use of backup plant in the ETS sector that is based on cleaner and more efficient fuel choices. In other industries that have shown a noticeable decrease is, for example, the cement industry, where there's a decrease of 40% in emissions since 2005, or 22% since 2018. And I'm going to look in a little bit more detail at the cement industry. It reflects the evolution too of the ETS, because we started off with a pilot phase in 2005-2007, where there was a national allocation plan, and a lot of industries received their free allocation on the basis of their historical emissions, what's called grandfathering. And that went on through the second trading period as well. And then in the third trading period, the power gen sector got no free allocation, but free allocation was continued for those sectors that were deemed subject to carbon leakage. And that carbon leakage was already explained to you this morning but I'll just recap quickly. It's refers to the movement of production outside the EU or the EEA to less carbon-constrained locations. So in order to prevent that happening, many industries still received, from 2013 onwards, still received free allocation. And that was subject to an assessment also of their carbon leakage risk. And so for some, their products were considered to be non-carbon leakage, and their free allocation ramped down from 80% down to 30% by 2020. So in the cement sector, you can see that emissions are considerably decreasing as the free allocation decreases. The slide shows the level of free allocation to production of cement in the 4 Irish plants since the inception of the EU ETS. There's been some criticism that there's been too much grandfathering and too much of a windfall to the cement sector. But with the move to allocation according to an EU-wide benchmark in 2013, I think you can see that the emissions, the verified emissions each year, and the actual free allocation are more closely aligned. And the evolution of the rules in the ETS mean that from 2021, there's dynamic free allocation. So that means that the allocation is initially determined on a historical baseline for a 5-year period, but then it can be amended each year up or down to take account of lower levels of production. And that the rules are complex. It's quite an administrative burden for both the operators and for the EPA and the EU Commission, who do the final assessment of whether or not there is a need for an adjustment. But it is meaning that the actual emissions are closer aligned with the free allocation, and that there is less of a windfall available. And you can see there for the cement industry that overall since 2021, the emissions are about 87.8% covered by free allocation. But it's still not perfect. And we are, for example, in the cement industry, we can see that the carbon intensity of grey cement clinker is still quite a bit above the benchmark that is applied. The benchmark was revised downwards in 2021, and we're still quite a bit above that. So what's the answer to doing away with free allocation? Because of the administrative burden, because of the fact that it's still open to some over allocation at times. The best answer seems to come up from the European Commission is that the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the aim of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, as you already heard this morning, is to abolish the need for free allocation. It'll be introduced on a phased basis for industrial products, but not for electricity imports. So from 2026 onwards, 100% of the carbon price embedded in electricity imports will be required to be covered by the CBAM certificates. But for other products like cement, it will be gradually introduced, as the graph shows. And the industries currently receiving free allocation in the ETS have therefore a strong interest in seeing that CBAM is working correctly. It hasn't been without its teething problems, as you heard from Luca De Carli earlier. The threshold initially was set too low, and I think it's a good example that the Commission have recognised this, that they took on board the concerns of the Member States and other stakeholders, and they introduced a simplification proposal, which we're very hopeful will be passed through the Parliament and the Council and will be actually confirmed by July of this year. Because that's going to make both the administrative burden for ourselves and for other stakeholders considerably reduced. Just quickly, you've heard a lot about CBAM, so in case you had come across it for the first time today, it does introduce a fair price on the carbon emitted during production of carbon-intensive goods entering the EU, and it also encourages cleaner production in third countries and the adoption of emissions trading systems and carbon taxes. The CBAM goods are iron and steel, fertilisers, aluminium, cement, hydrogen and electricity. and the initial threshold was far too low at €150 in terms of actual monetary value. And hopefully that will be changed under the simplification proposal. And, you know, it includes a lot of goods imported online, and so it placed a burden on the logistics companies as well, who were involved in declaring those goods. So what's in the future for the ETS? Well, as I mentioned, ETS 1, there's been a big drop in emissions because of the entrance of renewables into our electricity generation, but industry itself needs to play a bigger role. Aviation, I didn't mention aviation, but there's been a growth in emissions over the period from aviation. And so free allocation is finishing this year to the aviation sector, and sustainable aviation fuels are going to be key to making reductions in that area. And you'll hear more about aviation this afternoon from one of the stakeholders. ETS Maritime is a new area for the EPA, and we've had reports of emissions for the first time this year. So that's another area where there's a gradual phase-in of the ETS. And again, they'll be relying a lot on the use of sustainable fuels in the future. And in parallel, there are other EU initiatives to encourage the use of sustainable fuels in both aviation and maritime under the Refuel EU Aviation. And that's also a challenge for us to try and use the fact that there are two different instruments and to have good cooperation between the different regulatory bodies involved. ETS 2 is the new and parallel system which has commenced in terms of permitting, monitoring and reporting this year. It will only have a financial impact across the EU from 2028 for the 2027 emissions. But Ireland has negotiated a derogation, and hopefully that will work as long as our carbon tax is sufficiently high. And it applies to all the sectors covered by the ETS 2. So really the question is that it's an upstream system, very different from ETS 1. So it's the fuel suppliers that are regulated, and will it translate into a downstream change in behaviour? And as you heard today, there's a very strong need for that if we're going to meet our targets under the effort sharing regulation. So we'll be looking closely at whether or not ETS 2 effectively supports those moves. And CBAM, finally, as I mentioned, we're waiting to hear about the simplification. And then at the end of this year, there will also be the possibility that CBAM is expanded to include other products, so that eventually all sectors covered under the ETS 1 are also covered under CBAM, and we can move away from free allocation. And so there's a lot going on in this sector, and I think we're all looking forward to seeing what the future will hold. So thank you for your attention, and look forward to your questions.